Welcome to Sketchbook Legends. I'm your artist, Paul Hostetler. Today we're drawing Robocop, the title character from the 1987 science fiction dystopian satire of American society, Robocop. Like most movies written on spec, it's hard to say who the creator of Robocop actually is. Paul Verhoeven usually gets credit as the director, but the script was written by screenwriters Edward Neumeier and Michael Miner. Most of the satire in the movie comes from the writers, but the visuals, of course, come from Verhoeven, and the design of Robocop comes from production designer Ron Bobbitt and his team of artists. Now, at the time he came up with the idea, Edward Neumeier was a junior executive at Universal Pictures. He was in charge of reading scripts. He had a small part to play in bringing Blade Runner to the big screen. And the production of Blade Runner, I guess, stuck in his mind, given that it is about a cop who chases and arrests robots. And he thought to himself, what if there was a cop who was a robot? And he came up with the title Robocop. And from there, he just needed to write a script. At that point, I believe it goes that Michael Miner stuck his head into Neumeier's office and said, "What are you working on?" Neumeier said, "Robocop." And Michael Miner said, "Sounds great. Can I be a part of this?" And the two joined forces. Now, Neumeier came up with the name Robocop, whom he envisioned as a cop who was a robot. Michael Miner had the idea of Super Cop, the plot of which involved a cop who is killed and comes back to life with superpowers. And together they combined these two ideas and formed the basis of the plot for Robocop. As a sidebar, Miner's idea of a person being killed and coming back to life with superpowers to exact vengeance on his assailants is a very well-worn storytelling cliche. Going back a little bit in comic books, Will Eisner's The Spirit involves a cop who is attacked and left for dead and plays dead, essentially fakes his own death in order to continue a life of crime fighting. Jerry Siegel, the man who invented Superman, along with his partner Joe Shuster, but Jerry Siegel also came up with the idea of the Spectre, about a policeman who's killed in the line of duty and comes back as a ghost with supernatural powers. Later on, there was The Crow, an independent comic book about a musician who's killed and comes back with supernatural powers. There are other examples. Swamp Thing falls into a swamp and gains swamp powers. Dead Man is an acrobat who comes back to life as a vigilante ghost. There's Nightman, filmed by Sam Raimi. Roughly the same concept. Spawn, in which a man comes back with power specifically from hell. Red Hood, a former Batman sidekick, and too many others to name. There are a lot of comic book references in Robocop. At one point, you can see issues of Iron Man and Rom the Space Knight on a shelf in a convenience store. Both of these comics involve a protagonist who wears a superpowered metal suit, just like Robocop. Another big influence on Robocop is the British comic book, Judge Dredd, also a dystopian fascist satire of a cop, which in satire cops are called judges, able to arrest, judge, and execute civilians on sight, who is obsessed with law and order and goes to insane, cataclysmic lengths to punish crimes as tiny as jaywalking or littering. There have been a couple of movie adaptations of Judge Dredd in which that sort of biting satire is muted down and they turn him into sort of a generic hero figure. But one of the main visual icons of Judge Dredd is that he is so dedicated to his job that he never removes his helmet, so you can never see his eyes, which is one of the design features present in Robocop, is that he's got a big metal helmet that can't be removed. At one point in the movie, he does actually remove it, but it requires an extremely painful process. And actually, that point in the movie signifies his rejection of the label of Robocop and his return to human feelings. But I wanted to draw my version with the helmet on. It's a very iconic piece of design. One of the reasons I wanted to draw Robocop is that the iconic elements of the costume are so simple and clean that you can really draw your way around any other part of the ensemble. And as long as you have the round helmet with the eye visor that's sort of just a little slit across the face, and the chin strap and the big bulky arms, you can get away with calling the character you've created Robocop. Robocop as a concept came out right after Terminator came out, which made it pretty easy for Neumeier and Miner to sell their script to the same studio, Orion. But that's when the trouble started, because they could not find a director willing to work on something with such a silly title. Even the director that eventually took the reins on the project, Paul Verhoeven, passed on it twice and apparently needed a lot of convincing from his wife before he agreed to direct the movie. It didn't hurt that his previous movies were state-funded. I don't remember which country Paul Verhoeven is from, but they pour a lot more money into the arts than America does at the governmental level, and his funding ran out for political reasons. So this was sort of a money job for him, at least at first. It became a theme during the production of Robocop that every single aspect of making the film turned out to be much harder than it sounded like it should be, and that nobody, absolutely nobody, enjoyed it. Part of it was that Paul Verhoeven had never directed a big budget action science fiction movie before, so he didn't know quite how to go about talking to people like production designers or stunt people, but nobody had a good time making Robocop, especially the main actor, Peter Weller. Weller was cast late in the process, and this was based mostly on his willingness to act in the big plastic suit. He also had training in martial arts and training as a mime, which were big pluses given that Robocop's movements are very mechanical and have to be planned out ahead of time. So they thought he could pull it off, and he thought he could pull it off, and he didn't realize how hard it would be to pull it off until he got on set. The suit itself, the Robocop suit, was designed by production designer Rob Bottin. He was aware of Judge Dredd, and many of the early concepts for the suit look very much like Judge Dredd in their design. Eventually, he also drew inspiration from the chrome androids of airbrush artist Hajime Suriyama. The final design involved a foam rubber undersuit that Peter Weller had to wear over his entire body. And on top of that, there was molded plastic armor attached with hooks. And the entire thing was almost impossible for Weller to move in. You can see him drawing these big square fingers. Those were rubber gloves, which made it really hard for Weller to actually hold on to anything because he had to squeeze really hard. There's one scene where he had to catch a keychain in his open hand, and even though he rehearsed it, he hadn't rehearsed it with the suit on, and the keys kept bouncing off the rubber gloves, and it took him like 40 takes to grab the keychain. And that was the first day of filming. It was all he had to do was walk from one end of the room to the other and catch a keychain. And after a few tries, he just said, "I can't do this. I've spent months training, but I can't, all my training is useless now that I'm actually in the suit." And then he and Verhoeven got in a yelling match, and Verhoeven finally let him take a few weeks off for more training. They made multiple suits for the film, some for Weller, some for stuntmen. A couple of the suits were fireproof for the big explosion scenes. There were suits with damage and bullet holes sculpted in. And every night, any suit that was used had to be washed because Weller was so tightly wrapped in that it would absorb all of his sweat. So all of the suits needed to be washed. And also, they would all need to be repaired and repainted every single night because the paint would chip off. And you can see I'm drawing a lot of little parts, little machine parts on the suit. The movie version didn't have quite as many little greeblies, pistons and stuff, but still, parts would begin to fall off by the end of the day, and the production team would have to run in with a hot glue gun and glue things back into place between takes. Given how hard it was to put the suit on, the first time it took 11 hours, and I think it got a little bit better after that. But it wasn't something that he could easily take off. So in order to, do a good job playing Robocop, Weller decided he had to stay in character for as long as he was wearing the suit, even during meals, apparently. There's one anecdote in which Weller spotted a guy eating Oreos in between takes and started yelling, "Robo wants an Oreo," to the staff. But the guy had completely finished all of his Oreos. So Weller was just left in his Robocop suit yelling, "Robo wants an Oreo," over and over and over until someone found a vending machine that sold Oreos and got him a couple of Oreos to eat. It should be said that this is based on one person's account, and that Weller did not think that was an accurate portrayal of how he acted on set. You can see here I'm working on the legs for Robocop. Like I said, a lot of these little details are things that aren't in the original costume, or may have been just molded into the plastic, and I've taken them out of the plastic and sort of made them their own separate pieces, as if this was an action figure that you had to put together. Right here you can see the full Robocop pose. I'm basing this off of a design for the cover of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. If you take a look at that cover, Batman, who's the protagonist of that series, fills the entire page, and he's sort of hunched over and kneeling, and there isn't a square inch of the comic book cover that doesn't have the bulk of Batman somewhere in it. And the effect is to just make Batman look huge and imposing and menacing. And that's kind of the effect I was going for here. It's a very similar pose to what Frank Miller came up with, and Fun fact, Frank Miller was involved in the writing of the Robocop sequels. I think there was a Hollywood writers' strike right after Robocop 1 came out in theaters, so they turned to comic book writers as scabs, and Frank Miller took the job and came up with a couple of ideas, which they went with, and for better or for worse, nobody thought the sequels were as good as the original film. I may get more into that later, but it seems like Frank Miller had his strengths as a writer, but the specific kind of satire that made Robocop popular wasn't one of them. There are a lot of little details in Robocop that add to the satire. For example, one might notice that every police officer in the movie, and there are quite a few, every police officer is named after a prominent American serial killer. There are also fake television programs and ads throughout the movie, including one for a car called the 6000 SUX, or SUX, that proudly claims that it's made in Detroit, where Robocop is supposed to be placed. Set. Robocop was also supposed to have a custom science fiction style car with a lot of blinking lights and, pistons and stuff, but it turns out that the car that they made was too small to fit the Robocop suit. So instead, they just scrapped the science fiction car altogether and used a Ford Taurus. No, I don't have to mention the ED-209 robot because I'm not drawing him, but it's important since it was designed by Phil Tippett, who also worked on the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park and the Gremlins in Gremlins and a lot of the classic 80s monsters. If there's a stop motion that you find particularly impressive in the 80s, Phil Tippett probably had a hand in it. He designed the ED-209 as an antagonist to Robocop. You can see Robocop's face a little bit, so Tippett wanted to go in the opposite direction and have no cameras or eyes or anything on the ED-209. He modeled it after helicopter noses and also on orca whales, in which on an orca whale the eyes are kind of hidden by the giant white eye spot. Phil Tippett made a foot-tall animatronic version of the ED-209 for animation, and he also made a 7-foot-tall version to have around on the set just so people could get a sense of how large it was, and it actually made it into the movie at certain points when the ED-209 is supposed to just be standing and not moving. Robocop, I don't think Robocop would still be around nearly 40 years later if it didn't also have something to say that was worth remembering. First and foremost are the jabs at police militarization and corporate corruption that hit slightly different now that the real world's violence and cruelty and corruption are even more exaggerated than the fictional movies. There's the commentary on the interdependence of modern society and technology. The penultimate scene has Robocop telling a wounded colleague, "They'll fix you. They fix everything." And it sounds honestly more like a threat than a promise. Verhoeven inserted a lot of Christ imagery into the movie. When Weller's character, whose name is Murphy before it becomes Robocop, is killed, his death scene is played like a crucifixion. Later, the character of Robocop walks through a shallow puddle, which looks kind of like he's walking on water. And in his final battle, he's stabbed through the side with an iron spear. Verhoeven justified his involvement with the movie by saying that he wanted to make a movie where Jesus kills Satan. And the bad guys in this movie are honestly about as evil as one could imagine a person being. And I personally think it's kind of funny that all of the bad guys end up looking like sitcom dads. And at least one of them, and at least two of them, came from sitcom dad world or went on to play sitcom dads. Another one went on to play a dad in Twin Peaks. They all have very much a suburban dad vibe, even if they're firing machine guns into a crowd, which can also be taken as an extremely dark satire. I also think that most poignantly there is a theme of nostalgia and wishful thinking throughout the movie. In the beginning, Weller's character Murphy practices spinning his gun in imitation of a science fiction hero his kid likes. Later, as Robocop, he discovers that his wife and his kid have sold their house and moved out of the state, and that despite being a real science fiction hero who can spin his gun, he has no one left to impress. What technology has given him is far less than what it took away, even if the end result is an extremely cool-looking product. That darkness pervades the whole movie. But since the movie itself was titled Robocop, they immediately set up a Marvel comic book for kids to read and a line of toys. And a couple of cartoon shows. All of the sequels to Robocop ended up being PG-13 because they wanted to attract younger audiences. The original was rated R for extreme violence, which was warranted. It almost got an X rating for violence. Frank Miller's script for the Robocop sequel got broken into 2 movies, one of which involves a drug kingpin who gets implanted in a big metal robot body, like Robocop, but larger. And the sequel involves robot ninjas, and Robocop gets a jetpack. And it was so horrible from the get-go that even Peter Weller refused to be a part of it. But fortunately, his character is covered mostly with a giant metal mask, so they just cast somebody else. There was a reboot sequel made in 2018, also rated PG-13, starring Joel Kinnaman. This was the first one, also written by Newmeyer and Miner again. And it was also not good. The filmmakers tried very hard to make Robocop cool instead of realizing him as sort of a relic before he began. And they ended up pleasing no one. I believe after that, the rights to the character were sold to Amazon, and Jeff Bezos's lackeys are now planning a 3rd live-action TV series starring the character, because they fix everything. And every time they fix something, it looks cooler, but it turns out worse. If that's the message of anything, it's the message of Robocop. And we, the public, just have to deal with all of this crud being flung at us that we didn't ask for. Cory Doctorow called it enshittification, but it could easily also be called Robocopization. Just like Robocop, I'll bet even the iPhone 17 would rather have remained dead. And that's Robocop. If you liked this video, click the like button. If you want to subscribe to the channel to get more of my weekly videos, you can click the subscribe button. This is simple enough stuff. You've heard it before. If you want to follow me on social media, I'm on Blue Sky exclusively at phostetlerart, all one word. Link below. And if you'd like to send me some money for all of this, I am on Patreon at phostetlerart. Thanks for watching. Stay sketching. Stay legendary. See you next time.